FEMA floodplain regulations. The county has limited land use authority. We do regulate property use within the floodplain. That's required for us to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. It applies to all unincorporated areas. It's an essential to us maintaining flood insurance rate countywide. As you may know, the county a little over a year ago received what they affectionately call a community assistance visit, which means basically an audit where the state came in and reviewed various properties that were in the floodplain. They determined that the county's floodplain regulations were sufficient, but its enforcement was not. That wasn't exactly an accurate conclusion. That was their conclusion. A majority of those problems were on the peninsula. There were a lot of letters that went out. Everybody's heard about the letters and the issues, etc. Okay, let's talk about the CAV first. About a third of the violations that were identified have been corrected. We should have about another third that will be corrected by the end of the calendar year. Hopefully the rest will be corrected within the early part of next year. This is the big picture issue. I spent a lot of time on this in the months that followed. I received a lot of calls from constituents concerned about the notices they were receiving from the county about enforcement. My background is in commercial real estate and development and permitting, and I know a little bit about that. I also practice a little local government law, so I tend to know the questions to ask. I asked lots of questions when people would call me, and mostly what I found, well, there were a lot of violations that were bad violations and needed to be fixed, but I also found, as I would hear from constituents and then I would call county engineering and I would ask them questions, I found that there were some major problems in the county's floodplain regulations. There were what I call holes in the regulations, and that's a problem. And I think the way the regulations have been written have been causing a lot of problems over the years in terms of inconsistent enforcement, which makes people perceive that they're being enforced against arbitrarily, and also lack of clarity for people. They don't understand how they're supposed to build. The answers, they can't get clear answers, in part because the rules have been written so badly. So the county's new county engineer is a certified floodplain manager. In addition to that, we've hired John Grounds, who's also with LJA Engineering. He is an officer in the State Floodplain Managers Association. We have hired him to assist the county in rewriting its floodplain regulations. That is to your benefit. Why are we revising them? There are too many holes in the regulations, which has led to inconsistent enforcement and problems for property owners. Sometimes people have felt like county staff tells one person one thing and somebody else something different. Who's heard that complaint? Part of that is because the rules were often not written down, and the leadership in the department therefore was sort of giving an answer. And sometimes the answer was right, sometimes it just was whatever it was for the day. And even if people were trying to act in good faith, you all know if I give person A an answer and a week later the same issue comes up, I don't remember what I told person A. I might accidentally give a different answer to person B, even if I'm trying to do my best. Or maybe I just woke up on a different side of the bed. And so having holes in the regulations, meaning issues that the regulations simply don't address, has led to the county kind of making it up to fill the gaps, which is not a good way to do business. Not a good way. So here's the process that we're going to go through. First, we are going to complete an amendment to our rules on accessory structures only. Morgan buildings, tough sheds. Our regulations say nothing about the issues. Nothing. People have been told for years that they have to have a no bigger than 10 by 10 accessory structure. I will tell you, they were making it up. Sean didn't make it up. Okay, Sean didn't make it up. There were a couple of elected officials who verbally made a decision with the former leadership of the engineering department that they were going to have a 10 by 10 rule. That rule was never written down. It was reasonably consistently enforced in a top-down directive, but it was never written down. Commissioners Court never voted on it. It is not part of the regulations. And so when people began to call me and say, Ryan, why am I having to take a chainsaw to my 10 by 12 building? And I'm asking county engineering why, I asked good questions, and I was not happy with the answers. And this has led to a lot of work on my end to try to get this cleaned up. The permitting rules, which currently don't make a lot of sense, the permitting rules for RVs and trailers, the purpose of the permit is to create a tracking system so that the county can follow up and make sure, as required by FEMA, on every 180-day basis, that the vehicle continues to be roadworthy if it remains there for that period of time. That's a FEMA requirement. What doesn't make sense is that the county's been issuing these permits and then never following up. Because the whole reason to have the permit is the only reason to permit RVs in the whole world is so that the county has a tickler system to remind the county staff to go and check on that and make sure that those vehicles are in compliance.
Is that effective in all the floodplains of Texas?
It is. Now, you're not required to have the permitting system, but all floodplains, they are required to go and follow up. So the permitting system is intended to be a tool to make it easier for the government to do its job of following up. But here, we haven't been following up. So we've been issuing a permit process and then not using it for the only reason for which it exists. What I would really like to do, and I've talked to our consultant about this, what I'm hoping to do on the inspection issue with the RVs and trailers is I'm hoping to kind of outsource it and say, you know, the state of Texas through the Department of Motor Vehicles inspects vehicles, and if your vehicle's been inspected and you've got the tag, the state's determined it's roadworthy, and try to get the county out of the business of inspecting vehicles altogether and just using that as a surrogate. There's some issues we got to deal with on the process side that I don't want to bore you with tonight, but there have been floodplain regs in effect since the 70s, and so to the extent that people have built knowingly in violation of the regs, that's a challenge. But mostly it would govern new construction. Because I anticipate, if you've been allowed to build 4 electrical outlets and now we change the regulations and under the new regulations you'd only be allowed 3, you're going to be good to go, no problem. Anything that was built by permit and allowed by the county, no problem. You're safe. Okay. Yes, sir.
Do you have a restroom down below floodplain?
Only your county.
You can have a shower as long as it's exterior. You cannot have a toilet under any circumstances. It is a goofy regulation. Even I had the regional director of FEMA more or less admit to me that it was largely goofy, but it is in the underlying FEMA rules that are promulgated out of Washington, and her response was basically, that's something that has to be changed in Washington, D.C. Because the folks in Washington say so.
Yeah, how did they get by the strip center down there? How did they do it?
A-zone. Some of that's in A-zones. Some of that's in A-zones.
I'm in an A-zone, so I can have one.
have a toilet in our garage?
Potentially. So there are potentials in A-zones. A-zones different than V-zones. And that's
Y'all all heard it when Sean came around.
part of the problem is the current regulations don't distinguish between A-zones and V-zones either. So there are things that are allowed in A-zones that are not allowed in V-zones, but our regulations don't distinguish, which is another big problem. So again, I'm going to be back talking about the issue in detail. We'll end up having a 2 or 3 hour workshop about that. Yes?
You know, they redid the FEMA map and changed A-zones to V-zones, V-zones to A-zones.
Yes.
2, 3, 4 years ago. But they've never approved it.
They're still tweaking it. I expect they'll implement it sometime next year.